From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Hi, welcome to the show. So what happens when we get tough on drugs? That's a good thing, right? I mean, you pass laws requiring mandatory sentences for selling the stuff, and the police get busy locking up the bad guys. But a decade later, thousands of people are in prison, and we're paying so much for it that somebody once said you could pay all of these guys $10 an hour to do something constructive, and it would cost less than incarceration. And it's not directly connected, but Chicago Public Schools said this week that, yep, it really will close maybe up to about 80 elementary schools, possibly bumping up the class size to 30 or even 40. And did we mention that according to the Sun-Times, it's quite likely that about 9 out of 10 of these students that are affected will be black? Well, the school sure could use some of that $817 million in new revenue the state expects to collect this year, but you can forget about that, too. It's all going to pay for pensions. And that's still not enough. The pension hole's so big, Governor Quinn says he's going to cut about $400 million more from education spending. Oh, and yes, murders fell dramatically in February. Was that Superintendent McCarthy's attention to so-called hotspots? Or was it just the cold weather? Well, we'll figure some of that out today as we talk to Angela Caputo, who is with us today from the Chicago Reporter. Welcome back.
Okay.
Glad to have you again. And our old buddy Salim Muwakkil from WVON is here. Salim, great to have you back again.
Great to be here.
So I think we ought to just start with the thing that is at the top of the news this week. I know this is not something either of you have written about right directly in the last week or so, but the prospect that Barbara Byrd Bennett might actually preside over the closing of 80 or some number like that elementary schools, what is the logic behind that?
Well, the logic, of course, is that the school population has declined. The youth who make up that demographic cohort are leaving the city in unprecedented numbers, and so that's the logic that folks are using. But the other logic is, of course, black students are the most disposable in this society, the least honored, and so whenever resources are restricted or denied, they are the victims often. And again, that's what we see happening.
And I mean, it's really stark in this, because if your criteria is that schools of a certain size have to have a certain number of people in them, then the number of schools that have these half-vacant buildings are generally in the black community. I mean, more disproportionately there, simply because of this population shift. But it also has other things to do. I mean, your sister publication, Catalyst, has written about this, that a lot of the population has been shifting into charter schools. So while CPS is talking about closing a lot of schools, they've also been opening a lot of schools.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's so devastating about this that I hear from people within communities where the schools are closing is that, you know, these are some of the few anchors that are left in the community. I mean, there's been so much disinvestment over the past decade that began with the foreclosure crisis, and now we're going to have more boarded up buildings and fewer central places within the community where there's a safety net. You know, at this point, these are schools where grandma lives down the block, and when mom's at work, you know, she can pick them up. Or they have a network of friends, you know, who can grab the kids if they're sick, or you know, if there's a problem. And so I think that, you know, that's really the thing that people are clamoring around. And one other thing I want to say is, you know, I think that there's this misperception in the coverage of this, that, you know, people don't care about their schools and people don't value education, which, you know, is totally wrong. If you've been following what Catalyst has been covering, I mean, you have hundreds of people who are showing up to these, you know, school
1,000
closures.
in some cases.
Yeah, right. And I think that, you know, that's really a missed story in this about how much people value their neighborhood schools and how important they are to their communities.
And I got to say that I know this is the naive thinking of people who don't want to deal with reality, I suppose, but there's also an incredible opportunity here to take some of these schools that are serving really distressed populations and say, hey, you know, in the spirit of what charter schools were once supposed to be, how about we take one of these schools, take 30 of these schools, and lower the class size to 15, put more resources into them. Okay, half the school or a quarter of the school won't be used, but we can use some of those rooms for other activities. Let's make these places real laboratories for what we could do in the inner city. Wouldn't that be amazing if a public school system decided to do something like that?
Oh, Ken, you need to be on the staff of some of these
I need to be put into the
for real, because I mean what was happening, I think in a larger sense, is that in a true example of what a scavenger society is, many people are trying to profit from the social failure of others. I mean, you see that in the prison system, where these profit-making prisons are popping up, and the charter school situation is similar in many ways. There are people making profits from operating these schools, and they use the underachievement of many of these students as a pretext to gain entry, and what they're actually doing is benefiting from the social failure, educational failure, and kind of that whole scavenger ethic is at work.
I like the pretext term. I think that it is a pretext, in my opinion.
I think the next conversation that's going to be on the horizon, I got a hint of this from a little letter that came home from my kid's school that said, hey, yeah, it's true that 2 schools in the neighborhood may close, and we don't know exactly how many are going to come from here, but we do hear you that you want to know how these underperforming kids are going to do and how they're going to affect our bottom line. And will we get some slack? Yeah. I mean, so I think that this is going to be the next conversation that we're going to start hearing. Okay, so if we're going to close these schools, where are the kids going to go?
Sounds like it will be a loud conversation.
Yeah,
yes.
I think so.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, we didn't actually invite you here today to talk about schools because it just came up in the news this morning, and I really want to talk about it. But both of you have done some great stuff recently on any number of issues regarding incarceration and just lots of things. But Angela, you have written a couple of pieces in the very latest Catalyst, we just happen to have right here, about the the alternate use of the Eisenhower Expressway, to put it wildly, the amount of heroin traffic that comes in from the western suburbs, and what that does to the central city of Chicago, and also the cost of incarceration, which I took some notes here, and I think we're looking at 147,000 people being sentenced from Chicago from 2000 to 2011, and that cost me as a state taxpayer $5.3 billion to keep these guys in prison.
Yeah, and two out of every 3 prison sentences was for a nonviolent offense. So we're basically, incarcerating people for hustling or stealing is what it comes down to. Yeah.
So, give me the big picture on this. What conclusions do you draw from this?
Well, I think the point of the story is to really bring this issue of money to the forefront. We're talking about, school closures because we don't have the money. We're talking about, what's happening with our state budget. We don't have the money, and the money is there. We just need to think about how we're spending it. And I think, that was the point of doing this story. What we did was I mapped out all of these sentences by census block. So here we're looking at, the most expensive blocks in the city, in this context, and they're in the poorest neighborhoods. And what would $4 million mean for a block, in Austin, where they're looking at shutting down 16 schools? Is it 16 schools in Austin?
Yeah. That's the last number I saw.
So $644 million spent over the last 11 years incarcerating people, primarily for drug dealing in Austin.
Just from Austin. Blocks.
Yeah. So what if we had invested $30 million of that each year? Would it say half the people deserve to go to prison? In the schools? What would that do for Austin?
Absolutely.
It would do something huge.
And the collateral damage of that kind of incarceration orientation. These guys, many of these folks are being imprisoned at the primary age of family formation,
right.
When they are absolutely necessary. They have the agency and the energy to be very productive in their communities if they had some productive activity to pursue. And there's simply been disinvestment, there's commercial inactivity. All many of these folks see is activity in the underground economy. And so it's a tragic waste of human potential.
Did you happen
really
to see the Cranes story a couple of days ago that Chicago's central business district is on a 10-year tear, that the investment in downtown is higher than it's ever been, and the number of jobs is up? I mean, it's like that 10 or 12 block radius centering on City Hall and radiating out is doing better than it's ever done before.
I did a story on this 2 years ago, and I looked at jobs, so I could tell on each block who worked there and where they came from. And what I found was, from the beginning to the end of the last decade, 86% of all the jobs that were lost in that downtown core area were people who live south of 41st Street.
Wow.
86%. So we're talking almost 9 out of every 10 jobs lost were people who lived.
And we've also done stories here about the increasing privatization of even city workers, the call center at the water department, the janitors at O'Hare, and that kind of thing. That these kind of blue collar positions are increasingly becoming outsourced, and they're being outsourced to people who are, in many cases, the jobs are actually being outsourced to outsourcing companies that provide the workers without benefits and so forth. And so you're seeing, again, the people who are losing out in this are the people at the bottom or second to bottom rungs.
But it's not just them that are losing out. We're all losing out, because how do you move forward as a city and as a state when you have so many communities where there's no growth in tax revenue? I mean, how do we build a stronger city when we don't have a productive city everywhere?
And then the social fragmentation. I mean, we're seeing indications of it, not just in the black community, but in other areas as well. But what's happening in the black community is this political fragmentation. There's a growing class animosity that I think is being exacerbated by this incarceration focus. We had this, for example, the GOP candidate for the second congressional seat is an ex-offender with a very ambitious agenda that is anti-traditional black leadership, what they would call the bourgeois black leadership, and that's a class animosity that is growing in the community, and that's also a ramification of this incarceration focus, because there's so many young people getting involved in that complex. They're not being trained. Of course, they're just being warehoused while they're there. And when they get out, recidivism is such a dominant pattern that is difficult for them to be reintegrated into the society. And so they develop strong animosities to traditional leadership, black leadership, and we see that being reflected.
You know, I'm sorry, this is just out of left field, but this whole brouhaha that's going on over Wayne Watson at Chicago State University, is that kind of the same thing? I mean, it sounds like you have kind of the old guard. Emil Jones is in the newspaper today supporting his old friend Wayne Watson, but it sounds like the critics are kind of a younger generation. I mean, I really don't understand that conflict at all. Do you?
Well, there are a number of issues involved. Some of it concerns the board. There's animosity on the board of Chicago State, and some of that is being reflected in these media reports that are trashing Wayne Watson. Whereas there are some who say that he's done more for Chicago State than any other previous leadership. But he has his critics, and some of them are from within the system who think that he's doing things in an old, antiquated way. But then there are others who say that he's steady and sure on the trigger and don't disrupt things at this point. And then it's personal animosity that's driving this.
And there are some board members whose terms are about to expire, and
who have their terms have expired.
Okay.
And they're in interim positions right now, and they're acting as if they have that kind of authority. And there's disputes about that.
So there must be pressure on. Does Governor Quinn appoint those positions?
Yes, Quinn does appoint them.
So there's pressure on Quinn then to
even more pressure on the governor.
Yeah, but he signed up for it, so it's
absolutely
that's the way it is, right? We do this to them, and then that sort of brings us back around again to the whole question of this, the question that just will never go away about violence and mayhem is, We saw these bizarre numbers in February, where the murder rate came down from 50-something to, I believe it was 14 or something like that. And I have to say that one of the things I've been very consistent with on this program is sitting here scratching my head and puzzling at why it is that Gary McCarthy has this thing that whenever the numbers go down, he likes to have a press conference saying, "You see, my policies are working." And then a week later, when they're back up, he's kind of not having press conferences anymore. Just give me a big picture thing. Do you think that his policies are working? Are they? Or I mean, I just don't have any idea anymore how to figure this out.
Ken, I think that we frame it in the wrong way by focusing on the criminal justice aspect of much of this interpersonal violence that we find. I think there are many other issues that are beyond criminal justice focus, but we frame it that way so relentlessly that that's the only way we look at it. And so when there's some variation in the statistics, the police are the first ones we look at, and I think that they are at best peripheral to this issue. I mean, by this heavy presence in hot zones, I think that may have some effect. It has a deterrent effect. People see police all over the place. They may be less ready to involve themselves in some sort of violent activity. But generally, these are interpersonal disputes, personal beefs that spiral out of control. And no matter how many police you have around, I don't think that has much effect on that in an overall sense.
Again, I want to bask in your collective wisdom on this, because it's a question that I've asked over and over, and I just really cannot get a fix on this myself. We've been debating since the day Rahm Emanuel announced for mayor the question of whether we need more bodies, whether we need more police officers, and whether that would help with, at least if nothing else. I understand it's not taking away the disease; it's treating the symptom, but the symptom is pretty awful when you have dead bodies laying around. So, could the killing be stopped if you hired on 200 or 300 more police officers? Do either of you have any sense about that?
Well, what I hear from people, I'm only a reporter, what I hear from people who are most intimately involved, in communities and work on trying to deter crime, prevent crime, they say there's no way that we can arrest our way out of this problem. Absolutely no way. It's, like you said, we're framing this problem in the wrong context. And, I did a piece a couple months ago about 17-year-olds. Illinois is one of a few states in the nation where 17 is an adult if you're charged with an adult felony.
As opposed to juvenile.
Yeah, we have more 17-year-olds arrested in Chicago than Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Houston combined.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, we are doing a lot of arresting. Our police are very active, and I guess the question is, are we perpetuating this problem? Because the Center for Disease Control says the younger people get into the criminal justice system, the more likely they are to continue reoffending. Are we perpetuating this with our policies, or are we preventing more serious crime? That's something that I don't think we're honestly talking about.
We're not honestly talking about it, and it has influences in our cultural expressions. I mean, many people now rail about the pop music in the black community and how gangster oriented it is. Well, much of that is because so many young people get under the influence of the criminal justice system. They have direct contact with that lifestyle, and so they reflect it in their culture, and then that perpetuates that type of thinking. And so it has an absolutely a devastating effect, I think, overall on Black America. And we have to begin to address this in a more serious way.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you go out to Little Village, what are people who are working on violence intervention doing? They're trying to set up guards who can cross kids home from school, so they don't feel like they need a gun to get to school and get home. I mean, when you look at the real solutions, the practical solutions of how to curb violence, it's not put more police on the corner. It's, you know, let's get parent patrols out there. Let's hire some people who are non-threatening that can help the kids, you know, get to and from. It's like bouncers on the corners to get the kids around to school.
And of
but
course,
they say that's working.
we don't know yet because we don't really know what this number is. But if it does turn out to be many schools being closed, then we could stir up that pot again of the difficulty of getting kids. Although they are elementary schools, it'll be a little different. But you still have this issue of kids having to travel a lot further to school than they might have had to do in the past.
Which is another issue that our you know, the city fathers fail to include in their considerations. You know, these gang territories, these turf battles that are being provoked by simply willy-nilly transferring students to another location. I mean, it's more than a notion, and I think that, you know, we should be a little bit more conscious of that and sensitive to it.
Yeah, I have to say that I think that Gary McCarthy has said a lot of these things and said them very publicly, which is something that I admire. But then again, then you have this kind of weird situation where he suddenly ramps up the overtime pay and has more officers out on the street for more hours, and apparently the number of killings comes down. So you have to ask yourself the question, is there some direct causative relationship between the number of police and the number of killings? I mean, I just don't know that anybody actually can say, but you know, and it looked like from the looks on your faces, you're kind of like me too, right?
Right. I don't think it's causative. I mean, I think there may be some peripheral effects, but I don't think it's causative.
But the thing, nevertheless, is that we are in a situation now where he's paying a lot more money. He's spending more money and putting more people out on the street. And of course, the union is saying, well, if you really want to do this, then you really have to hire more cops. But as we've observed before, he's in this interesting position where if he wants to stay on good terms with the mayor, he has to be on board with the mayor that we have perfectly enough people. We don't need any more officers.
Well, I think Pat Camden, who spoke on behalf of the police union, made a good point when he said, "Hey, this is a high burnout job, and you know this could cause additional problems." And I think that's something to really think about how police approach their work when they're exhausted, when they just like the kids in the neighborhood who can go from 0 to 60 in like 2 seconds because somebody rubs them the wrong way. I think police can go through the same thing, and so I think that
you need your police officers to be well relaxed,
well integrated,
and connected with the community, and you know, to not feel like they're only dealing with people who are you know, crazy.
And we'll get off of this, but that's another sort of a sub piece of this story that's always kind of been interesting to me, is that I don't quite know how you can. I mean, maybe in the short term, in terms of 24 hours or 48 hours, you can send a bunch of police officers into a really bad place and just like calm it. But in the long run, if these are folks who are from the outside, who don't even know where the corner is that they're supposed to go to, it just feels like it's just an occupying force, and it just exacerbates the whole problem and takes it up another notch.
And the drug war.
And by the way, I should say, occupying force is not my term; it's Gary McCarthy's. So
and they often appear to be that way. And when you frame it as a drug war, and much of the police activity, the paramilitary police activity, is oriented toward attacking this drug war, then you have enemy combatants if it's a war, and those combatants are generally these young people. And so you know that, and they consider the police an occupying force as well. And as long as there's this antagonistic relationship between the police and the community, we'll never have the kind of effective policing that we actually need in our community.
And you know, we started talking a little bit about the heroin trade thing, and then we kind of got ourselves off the topic, but we should come back to it for a minute or two. I mean, the piece that you've written here, Road to Ruin, is really interesting about how much of that trade there is, and the whole perverse economy that exists around it. And Nick Dumke did a piece recently in The Reader about the heroin trade on the west side, on Pulaski and Cicero, and it was
great piece.
It was really eye-opening to me because, you know, as I mean, this is such a trite thing to say, but as a lover of The Wire, it almost read like a script for another episode of The Wire. But it's real, and it was happening right here. Is happening right here in Chicago.
Well, the guy who wrote The Wire was a reporter in Baltimore.
That's right, in Baltimore.
Much like Mick.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Maybe Mick has some
in
screenwriting
his future. Yeah. You gonna say?
Oh no, I
you are.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I just find this really interesting, and I really strongly recommend that. If we got a minute or so left, any thoughts about what's going on it's happening mostly up in Alderman Kappelman's ward, but this move to close the last of the SROs and what appears to be a real effort to just sort of clear out the last of the poor people in the north end of the city, and then this whole dust-up that happened with the Salvation Army food truck, and then it didn't happen, and now they all deny that it ever happened, and there it is, the truck is still there. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I started my first journalism job was at the Learner newspapers, which is a little community paper up in Uptown and Rogers Park. And so I knew James Cappelman back when he was not an alderman, just a community guy. And he would always start with two things: I'm a social worker, and this is not good for poor people. And I mean, this has been his thing long before he was the alderman. He he feels that a disservice is being done to poor people because there are just too many poor people in Uptown to really help people to get on their feet. On the flip side, though, I mean, a lot of the people who've glommed onto that are new condo owners, are the gentrifying class, and so Uptown is, Uptown was Uptown before they came. And so, they have this vision and they want to turn Uptown around. But, Uptown is a really special place. It's a place where if you are down on your luck, you can live in a single room occupancy, like the ones at the Chateau that could be closed. And it's a relatively secure community. There's obviously some violence, but it's a lot more secure. It's an opportunity area where it's close to, jobs, and I think that, it's James Cappelman is just kind of making a bad name for himself right now.
So I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Which side is James Cappelman on? I can't figure it out. Is he with the developers that he just wants to throw all the poor people out, or is he genuinely concerned about them?
I don't know if I can answer that.
An unfair question to ask a reporter, I know. You never do that kind of... Well, I'll just say I can't figure it out because it just seems to me that some of the things he said really make him look like he's really just in there with the developers.
Poverty's ugly.
Yes, it is.
It is very ugly,
right,
and people don't want to look at it.
It is, right,
good for
people
tourism.
don't want to look at it. And,
certainly right.
And
right.
I mean, I think a lot of people just don't.
Yeah.
They feel like I'm spending this kind of money to live in this neighborhood, and I shouldn't have to deal with it.
How are you going to get all those people
that's what it comes down to.
How are you going to get all those people to ride the red line up to the refurbished Uptown Theater if there are poor people around?
Well, I had a...
We gotta run. I'm sorry. I've really enjoyed having you here today. There are so many things to talk about, and as we've discovered today, every single one of these things is completely interconnected with each and every other one of them, right? It's all the same story. And we'll just keep telling it over and over again as we come back to you next week. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. I think you know all about that. But you can find us right here on cable by going to this very address that you see on your screen right now. Any old time at all, you can watch this show. And you can also subscribe on iTunes, both as a video or an audio podcast. And if you keep watching, you'll see Salim Muwakkil and Angela Caputo right back here again, I hope sometime soon. But thanks very much, Angela from the Reporter and Salim from WVON. See you next week on Chicago Newsroom. Bye.